All right, hello and welcome. So today we're going to talk about the Shadow Dagger Falconer build and the changes for 1.1. I'm doing this live on Twitch, so my chat is here, and I told them they can ask questions as we go that are relevant to the guide, so I may be answering some questions from them, but we should be able to do a pretty good job of generally keeping on track. So the first thing we'll do is show some footage from 1.0. This is all 1.0 footage actually from the last build guide video. And don't worry about the Leonard Skinner thing. That was a joke we did last patch. We won't be doing this patch because I don't have time to make jokes. But the play style is very similar. There are some changes to it, but this is generally what you're getting into if you want to play this build. It is one of the fastest builds in the game, especially later once you get everything up and running, get like lots of cooldown, and get a new pair of unique boots that now exist that are like really sweet. But this is actually going to be my starter build for 1.1. So if you want something really fast that also levels well and scales well throughout, it's a really good build. Okay, so the general concept of this build, if you're not familiar with it, is we use Shadow Daggers, which are actually a sub-skill that proc from other skills. In particular, they proc in this build from Umbral Blades and from Puncture. We're going to use Aerial Assault, which is a skill where our Hawk picks us up, or Falcon, excuse me. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Falcon. I'm actually not sure what the gender of the Falcon is. I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Falcon, for mislabeling you. But yeah, we're going to use the Falcon to pick us up and actually fling us across the battlefield, which is a great movement ability that also throws out a bunch of Umbral Blades at the end, which proc Shadow Daggers and also explode, doing more Shadow Dagger procs, which does a lot of damage. And when we're in single target, a change from last patch we used Net to actually proc Puncture, which proc Shadow Daggers. I know it's very confusing, but now it's a little less confusing because we just use Puncture in single target when Aerial Assault's off cooldown to proc Shadow Daggers, and it actually does 2 stacks when it's used directly, which is why we're not using Net anymore. All this is to say it's a really fast build that does plenty of damage, especially in clear, but has actually gotten better on single target than it used to be, which was one of its like quote-unquote weaknesses. But now it's actually quite good at that. It's not one of the very best, but it's quite good at that. So what's up, Marion? How you doing, man? So yeah, all this also to say that this is my starter and it's really good, and I believe it's going to be good enough to kill the Pinnacle boss, especially if you get some of the really good gear that's in here. So if you're looking for something fast that you can scale up quickly, and you like the idea of having your Falcon fling you around and do a bunch of Shadow Daggers and just blow up things, this is a really good build for that. So what's up, Rodden? Let's get into some details here, and then we'll cover also some of the changes. We already covered a few, but we'll cover some more. The pros, it's actually reasonably tanky. We're not going low life like we used to. Last patch we go low life. That's no longer a really good option, especially with the new uniques, the unique Razor Fall that we'll talk about a bit. But despite that, with all the changes the game has undergone in comparison to other builds, it is reasonably tanky. It is under certain circumstances very tanky, especially with a very high dodge it has. But even HP scaling and general defense is pretty good. It's exceptionally fast, especially late game. It has very good damage, and there's no content that's bad at. It's good at everything. Cons, it's somewhat minion reliant, just insofar as when your Falcon hits things, you get some cooldown reduction on Aerial Assault, which you don't really have any control over, very little control over. So if it's like off doing its own thing, it's a bit of an annoyance, but honestly, it makes very little difference in the build overall. There is some mana management, but once you get to the end, it's really almost no mana management, so it's not really a problem at all, especially since we don't use Net anymore. It is vulnerable when not moving, but it also not as vulnerable as it used to be. It loses 20% damage reduction when you're not moving. It used to lose, when we were using Wings of Argentus, a double 20%. We've now swapped out of Wings, so that's not a problem anymore, but it still loses the 120%. It also requires uniques to max the build, and this is quite unique reliant. In fact, I think most builds at this point and the very late game, the Aspirational as we're calling it, which used to be called Best in Slot, most builds are going to be very unique reliant and be very grindy. So that's not really that much of a con, but it is there. And to get the ball really rolling on it, you do need some uniques, like some Smoke Weavers and some Razor Ball, and a very easy to farm Siphon of Anguish, and a somewhat easy to farm Carcinization. This is really hard to say. Carcinization of Momentum, But overall, getting it going is not hard, and then, you know, getting it to aspirational is quite a bit more challenging. But again, I think that's true of most builds. As far as the skills, there's not a whole lot of changes here. Umbral Blades is still being used in it, and we're using both the spinning Cacophony of Steel Blade Storms and the explosive blades to do additional procs of Shadow Daggers. Aerial Assault is mostly the same, except we no longer care about Gustborn Guard because we're not going low life ever, and we're taking some dodge rating while traveling. Other than that, it's pretty much the same. We are still taking Plume Daggers. This is the one that used to be Proxy Shadow Dagger, so it gave you like double Shadow Daggers. It was really good. They changed it to Armor Shred chance. I was gonna get out of it just because I was mad, but it's actually pretty solid still because it's an easy source of Armor Shred chance, and they did make up for it in other places where the build's actually arguably better, so I'm not mad anymore. So we still take it. Decoy is now entered the game, or entered the build, because Net is no longer in. And this is mostly going to give us some crit multi and some dodge when it's out, and just a number of decoys, 2 decoys. It's just another good defensive option. Make the enemy to target something else other than you. It's hard to get hit. Puncture is still in, but it's made a little bit differently because we are now gaining the Shadow Dagger chance is doubled when you directly use Puncture, and it's 100% chance, which means you get 2. We get 2 Shadow Dagger stacks. You need 4 for an actual proc to go off. So that's much better now directly used compared to indirectly used. And because of that, we're going to stack a bunch of attack speed with rapid strikes and with press the attack, which makes every 4 seconds, we just attack super fast, which makes it really, really good for just jumping in with an aerial assault and then holding it down and doing 3 very, very quick attacks and watching the enemy die. It's a very satisfying assassin-like playstyle now. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And then Smoke Bomb is still basically the same as it was. The big key to the Smoke Bomb setup is Smoke Blades. This gives you 20 melee and 20 throwing every second for 4 seconds. This is for as long as you're in there. So you get to 20, 40, 80. You get to 80 of each, and Shadow Daggers is tagged with both melee and throwing, so it's 160 added damage when you're in it for 4 seconds or longer, which really, really, really gives you a huge damage buff. So that's the only changes. The big one being Puncture and adding Decoy. Passives are mostly the same as they were before. The big difference is now in the Blade Dancer tree, where we take 4 points in Skia Synthesis, which gives us 40% more. That's a multiplier damage to rares and bosses. This is a huge buff to single target, and one of the reasons why I don't care all that much about losing the Shadow Dagger extra procs in Aerial Assault. One thing to point out here, though, is, in my opinion, this is a very poorly chosen place to put this 4-point bonus, because it makes people think that Shadow Daggers have something to do with shadow damage and shadows, and they don't. They have almost nothing to do with them. You can proc Shadow Daggers from shadows. It's possible to do that, but increasing your shadow damage will do nothing for your Shadow Dagger damage, so do not be confused by this. This probably should have been on once or something like that. It should not have been in Skia Synthesis. It's going to confuse people, so I'm telling you now, don't get confused by that. You don't want to increase shadow damage ever on a Shadow Dagger build. That is the only change on the passives. Gameplay is mostly the same too, except now instead of using Net, you use Puncture. And it's just, you have more decoys to taunt. So that's pretty much it. You jump in with Aerial Assault, you puncture single targets, you jump around even more. Aerial Assault, once you get to endgame and you have the new boots, is going to be up almost all the time. And you're going to be jumping around all over the battlefield. Jump into groups of enemies or close to them so that you hit them with maximum amount of your Umbral Blades and watch them all explode and die. All right, as far as gear goes, what's up, Amity? How you doing, man? What's up, Zal? Shadow Daggers doesn't equal shadow damage? Yeah. You know it's throwing crit? Yeah, but it would make sense, wouldn't it, if it actually was shadow damage, but it's not. It's very confusing. Okay, as far as changes here, I'm not going to go through starting advanced. They're pretty similar. One difference being that we now have carcinization of momentum, but outside of that, the big differences are we take 2 Smoke Weavers now for the massive amount of dodge rating on these. We don't need the added damage that much, especially with that Smoke Bomb node. It used to be on the other build that uses one of the other builds, the Blade Dancer build, that 2 Smoke Weavers was just too much for the network to handle. But the reason we didn't take it on this one is because the loss of damage was too much last patch. I don't believe it's going to be too much now. It's not that much anyway. And I think 2 Smoke Weavers is going to be totally fine, especially if you can get some LP on them and add increased physical damage or crit multi, which are both very, very close in scaling. Like, they're really, really close, and mostly depends on how much of each you have at any given time. So these are your primary stats on this. Added Fizz is good too. It just isn't quite as good for this build because it has so much added elsewhere. We're still taking Siphon of Anguish, at least in the end game. Carcinization of Momentum is a new unique that we're adding. It has some really good stats. Specifically, you have Swiftness. Now you do summon a crab if you evade. You don't need to evade in this build at all, by the way. Evading is pretty much pointless in this build because you're so fast. You don't care about summoning a crab either. That's just like if you want to have a crab friend, you can have one. What we care about in this is you have Swiftness that goes to 20% movement speed at level 100. It scales up over time. So it's just an easy way to get movement speed, and 20% is a lot. The increased armor is great. The all attributes is great, and the +6 vitality is great. So it's just a good ring for general stats, and it is fairly easy to get LP on this. It's a 50, which is not too bad. So it's a good ring to add. I've added this to just about all of my builds. At 20% move speed is so good, and then the other stats are good enough too that it's hard not to. The star of the show for Shadow Daggers, particularly Shadow Daggers Falconer, this patch is Razorfall. Razorfall does a number of things for this build. It does give +2 to all throwing attacks, which is fine. The 12 dexterity is nice. The movement speed on this is good. 20 and 18 is really good. The big ones, though, are Aerial Assault's Burst of Feathers, includes 2 Umbral Blades per 30 dexterity. And it is possible to get 120 dexterity, but our goal is generally 90, so it adds another 6 Umbral Blades every time you do Aerial Assaults. So it's just everything's going to die. So that's our goal. We get to 90 dexterity. We add another 6 Umbral Blades on top of what we already had, which I think basically doubles it. And that mostly makes up for the loss of the Shadow Dagger node and Aerial Assault, because all the Umbral Blades do a bunch of Shadow Dagger procs. You also gain haste and increased throwing attack speed for 2 seconds after using Aerial Assault. We don't care about throwing attack speed at all, but we do like haste. Haste is really good. And then another really big one is 20% chance to recover 12% of Aerial Assault's remaining cooldown on throwing hit. And guess what? Every Umbral Assault's a throwing hit, so, and they also hit more than once, so you're gonna get all 3 of those like every single time. And there's a huge boost to Aerial Assault's CDR. So that really, really kind of turbocharges the build. As far as Aspirational, it's fairly similar, but we add in some stuff that you're going to see in a lot of builds right now, like Null Portent, which has got Leech, it's got increased health, it's got Fizz Res, and it's got what ends up being 20% less damage taken because it's very easy to hit that resistance cap that's required on this. It does not have a 0 legendary potential, by the way, but I think it got a fairly reasonable legendary potential, so I think it's possible to get 2 LP on this. Just a generally strong defensive option as long as you get Fizz Pen with Shadow Daggers on this. Going for Aspirational, this is definitely very doable. Nihilist, you'll be seeing on just about every build, I think, at this point, too. You have to get good rolls on this because they can roll negative, so watch out for that. But you get +2 to all skills, 50% increased mana regen, 20% more. It's a multiplier armor, 15% to all res. I think this also has it's got a decent legendary potential level. If you do evade with this, it's like a bad thing, but we don't evade, so we don't care. Oh, you also get 12% increased health, increased mana, and 8% increased move speed on this. It's just a crazy stat stick, but you have to roll it well. It's kind of like the new Omnis, but even better. So be on the lookout for that. And then Red Ring of Alatria, or Atlaria, makes it's this first foray into any of my builds, really. I'm going to use it in 2 builds this time around because we are stacking dexterity, so we can get to that 180 total attributes. I don't think running 2 is better than running a Carcinization of Momentum at this point. Have discussed this with other people, and it just seems to make more sense to me to run one of these. But this gives you that nice all res, all attributes. Those are honestly the biggest thing. The dodge rating is nice too on this, and the move speed. So yeah, solid choice there. And then I am running a Twisted Heart in this setup for the increased health and the strength. Not really important, but if you get like a 2 LP on this with dexterity and health or crit multi, or even better, a 3 LP, this is a pretty strong thing. 20% increased health is a lot. You won't get anything like that on the relic spot, and the 16 strength is 64% increased armor. So kind of hard not to take that if you get a really good one, but not super important for this. Okay, next up, is it not Rune Master? Is what not Rune Master? Blessings are, I think I switched this to endurance. That's it. The other one was armor. Oh yeah, this is now all res. This was crit avoidance. We don't need crit avoidance anymore because we have blind, and blind has changed. Blind used to give you like, it made things erratic. They'd attack erratically, and they'd reduce crit strike chance by 50%, but they wouldn't remove it, which was pretty much pointless. You still had to cap your crit avoidance. Now it makes them unable to crit. And since we get blind on Smoke Weaver, and we're gonna run 2 of them, we don't need crit avoidance. If you're playing hardcore, you might still want to take it, because until you blind them, they can crit you. That could be bad when you're walking into a pack. But for softcore, it's not really a problem. So do bear that in mind, though. If you want to play hardcore, maybe you take crit avoidance. Idols are identical as they were. You're either going to take Fizz Pen, or you're going to take increased health with armor shred or elemental resistance, and then just health idols or whatever resistance you need in these slots. And we already talked about blind, so I think that pretty much covers everything. By the way, we have a new system where we can generate loot filters off of our system instead of doing manually. So now as the build updates, this can pretty much update automatically, as I understand it. So that's just a nice little feature we've got. Okay, that's everything for the Shadow Daggers Falconer build. As I said, I'll be playing this to start with, and I'm going to be having a good time with it. I hope you also have a good time with it. Feel free to ask me questions about it in the comments, or pop into Twitch chat to ask me about it as I'm playing it. And enjoy Cycle 1.1, and I'll see you all again real soon.